This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play 1775 Rebellion. 1775 Rebellion is an area control game that takes place during the Revolutionary War. This is a 2 to 4 player game published by Academy Games and designed by Bo Beckett and Jeff Stahl. 1775 Rebellion's rules are fairly simple, and a game can be completed in about an hour to 2 hours. Now let's take a look at the game objective, and I'll show you how 1775 Rebellion works. In 1775, players can choose to play the Continental Army, the Patriot Militia, the British Regulars, or Loyalist Militia. 1775 Rebellion supports up to 4 players. Players 1 and 2 can play on the fledgling American side, and players 3 and 4 can play the British side. In 2-player games, the Continental Army and the Patriot Militia is played by 1 player, and the British Regulars and the Loyalist Militia is played by the 2nd player. You can use a combination of these rules to support a 3-player game with a 1 versus 2 matchup. 1775 Rebellion also has supporting factions. Supporting the Americans are French Regulars. Supporting the British are the German Hessians. Native Americans can be on either side. The game is played across 8 rounds. The objective is for either side to secure as many of the 16 colonies as possible. For every colony that is secured, that side earns a victory point. The side with the most victory points wins. When the game begins, the British have complete control of Quebec, Nova Scotia, and Delaware. The Americans have complete control of Connecticut and Rhode Island. Having complete control of a colony grants you 2 things. The first is that you can muster troops in the city within your controlled colony. The second is that for every colony you control, you get a victory point towards winning the game. The game can end in 2 ways. The first way to end the game is that after round 3, if each faction plays their truce card, then the game ends, and the points are tallied up to determine the winner. The second way is that by round 8, all movement cards will be played and the game will be over. Now that you have a rough idea of how the game works, get your bits together, people. It's time to set up the game. First, you're going to set out the game board. Next, you're going to place the starting unit cubes. Now, a great design of this board is that the units you need to place to start the game are printed on the board itself, so you can just look at the board and place the cubes. This makes setting up each game very quick and easy. When you finish placing all the cubes, the board should look something like this. You can see that the Native Americans are strung along the northern part of the board. Here is the Patriot Militia. Here is the American Continental Army. Here is the Loyalist Militia. And here are the British forces. Now that we've got the cubes on the board, we're almost there, but we still have some setup to do. Next, we're going to determine turn order of each faction. I'm going to draw your attention to this section of the game board. This section of the board keeps track of the turn order as well as this current round of play. To determine the order of play, place the 4 turn order cubes in the black bag and one by one draw them out to determine the order of play, and then place them on the board. Now that we've established the order of play for setup, each faction can place 4 units in territories that they own. Finally, place the pawn on round marker 1. You use the pawn to keep track of which round you are at in the game. Next, each side is going to shuffle their deck and draw out their opening hand of 3 cards. And with that, setup is complete and we're ready to start playing the game. Okay, now that we have the game set up, let's slow down and take a look at how the game flows and how to play. First of all, we're going to take a look at the overall player turn phases. At the beginning of each round, the player turn markers are placed in the black bag and the new order of play is drawn out. The next order of play sequence is set up and we begin with the first player, which in this example is the Patriot Militia. Each player turn is divided into 3 phases. In phase 1, you're going to reinforce units. In phase 2, you're going to play 1 movement card and move the appropriate armies. And in phase 3, you're going to resolve any battles as a result of those moves. So let's take a look at each of these phases in greater detail. In the reinforce units phase, each faction is going to place 4 new units from their stockpile, as well as any units that have fled from the prior turn. In this example, we're looking at the Patriot Militia, so these are their units to place. So let's take a closer look at the fled unit spot on the board for our example. There are 2 white militia units that fled from a prior round, so the player also gets to place these. The Patriot Militia player would then be able to place these units near cities in colonies that they control. A faction can only place new units and fled units at cities in colonies that they control. As a reminder, at the beginning of the game, the British have control of Delaware, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. The American side has control of Connecticut and Rhode Island. When the game begins, the cities in these colonies are the only place that each respective side can place their units. To muster units in other cities, those colonies must be secured first. Once other colonies are secured, other cities will open up that you can muster troops into. Now you can see all the cities on the game board. Next in the player turn is the Move Armies phase. To fully understand this phase, we're going to learn about the game cards. Each faction in 1775 Rebellion has its own deck of cards, and those deck of cards are divided into 4 types. The first type is the Movement card. The second type is the Naval Movement card. The third type is the Truce card. And finally, there's the Event card. Now, let's take a look at each of these categories and see how they work. First, let's look at the Movement card. Every turn in a round, you will play 1 movement card. The left side of the movement card will tell you the number of armies that you can move. The right side of the movement card tells you the distance you can move, measured in the number of territories. Okay, let me show you how the movement cards work and how you form armies. For these examples, we're going to focus on Pennsylvania colony. We're going to take the role of the Patriot Militia, the white player. Let's say that we've decided to play a movement card that allows you to move 2 armies, 1 territory. Now, here's the part where people often get confused. The cubes are not armies. The cubes are units. You form armies by joining together units. You can only form an army from units in the same territory. And each army must be comprised of at least one unit of the faction playing the movement card. So for this card, we need to form two armies. Let's create our first army with one white Patriot Militia unit and one blue Continental Army unit. As long as you have that first white Patriot Militia unit, you can join as many other friendly colors into your army as are available in that territory. You can borrow your partner's units to form armies, and they can borrow your units. This is a team-based war game where players on one side share units amongst each other, which means you'll need to communicate very closely with your partner to make sure that your overall strategy will succeed. Let's form our second army with the two white Patriot Militia units in the territory to the south. Now that our two armies are formed, we can move them one territory in any direction. If you move into an empty territory or a territory with friendly units, then nothing happens. You've just redeployed your units. If you enter a space with enemy units, then combat ensues, and we'll cover that a little bit later. If you enter a territory with Native American units and they're not currently allied with another player, then they can form an alliance with you. If the Native American units are allied with an enemy player, then combat ensues. The key to remember is that your army can be comprised of as many units as you have in the territory. You can also split the units in a single territory to form two or more separate armies. Think about your movement card and with the units you have to deploy very carefully. The choice is up to you. Next, let's look at the naval movement card type. Naval movement cards can also be played as your one movement per turn. Naval unit cards are broken up into two types. The first type are warship cards. Warship cards will allow you to transport an army across a body of water to a destination on the other side. This particular warship card will allow you to make two separate warship movements. The second type of naval card are boat cards. Boat movement cards will allow you to add only 3 units to a boat and move them across a body of water. The first unit must always be of the faction playing the card. The last 2 units can be mixed or matched. Finally, there's a multiplier that shows you how many boats you have for the movement. So in this example, you can create 2 boats with 1 militia unit each and 2 other units that will go to the same location for a total of 6 units. Event cards work in one of 2 ways. The first type of event card allows you to modify gameplay in some fashion. For example, this George Washington event card allows you to move more armies than what's depicted on your movement card. The second type of event card allows you to add ally units. Basically, the American cards will usually allow you to add French regulars, and the British cards will allow you to add German Hessians. There are also a few cards that allow you to add Native American units. Event cards will specify when they can be played in the game and do not count against your one movement for the turn. Finally, we have truce cards. Truce cards are also played like movement cards and can be used for your one movement per turn. The primary use of truce cards, though, is to bring the game to an end. After round 3, once each faction has played their truce card, the game is over. Once the game ends, a victory point for each controlled colony is granted and the winner is decided. This can lead to a strategy that if one side is ahead, they can push to end the war. Since truce cards are played as movement cards, by round 8 all cards will be played and the game will end. Now this should give you a basic idea of how all the cards work. One way or another, this keeps the game at a brisk pace and makes sure it doesn't drag on. The final phase of the player turn is to resolve any battles that might have ensued from moving armies into enemy territory. Okay, let's replay our Patriot Militia movement card. Now our objective is to secure as many colonies as possible to get victory points to win the game. The colony of Pennsylvania is composed of 5 territories. To secure the colony for the Americans, we have to make sure we have control of the territories with the Native Americans and remove the enemy units from the territory with Philadelphia. To secure the colony, we do not need to have a unit in any empty territories. However, if an enemy unit moves into that territory, we'll lose control of the colony again. You always have to keep this in mind, especially in the bigger colonies. So, to secure Pennsylvania colony, we need to deal with the enemy units in the territory with Pennsylvania and the Native Americans in the north. I'm going to form my first army with just 1 white Patriot militia unit. Our second army is going to be composed of the 2 white Patriot militia units to the south of them. So our first army is going to move to the north and form an alliance with the Native Americans, thus securing that territory. Our second army of 2 Patriot militia are going to move into engagement with the Loyalist militia and the British regular in the territory with Philadelphia. Next, I'm going to show you a little bit more about how Native American units work, and then we're going to conduct our battle. Now, since we moved our units north and formed an alliance with the Native Americans there, let's pause for just a moment and look at the full Native American rules. So in this example, I've rearranged Pennsylvania a little bit so we could see all the different options. Native American units are neutral. They will side with either the American or British interests. To form an alliance with Native American units in a territory, a player needs to move one of their own units into that territory. As long as a player faction has their unit in a territory with Native American units, those units will be allied with them. However, if that unit leaves the territory, then those Native American units become neutral again. Another unit can enter that territory, and those same Native American units will form an alliance with them. The Native American units in an alliance will fight with that unit and move from territory to territory with that unit, as long as at least one of those units from that faction remains with them. Now here's the key point. Just because a faction has an alliance with certain Native American units does not mean all of them will follow the same faction. In fact, you can have an alliance with one group of Native Americans and the opposite side can have an alliance with another group of Native Americans. They're all in different tribes, so that's the way the Native American alliances work in 1775 Rebellion. Since this is a war game, you knew that sooner or later dice would come into play. And here we go. 1775 has a load of dice. The first rule is that not all battle dice are the same. Each battle dice is tuned to that particular faction's play style. There are 3 battle dice roll results. The first is a hit. The second is command decision, and the third is flee. These battle dice are designed to reflect the faction's military prowess. During this historical period, highly trained military units like French regulars and British regulars do not flee. They can only roll a hit or a command decision. Factions with less formal military training, like militia, have a greater chance of fleeing. Factions that fall between these two extremes of professional soldiers and informal militias have a greater chance of hitting, but still have a slight chance of fleeing. One of the most interesting aspects of 1775 Rebellion is planning these engagements with these different abilities. So now let's get back to our battle and see what happens. In 1775 Rebellion, each faction has a limit to the number of units that can be engaged in the battle at a time. The Continental Army can field 2 units at a time. The Patriot Militia can field 3, the French Regulars can field 2, and the Native Americans can field 2. Any additional units will wait in reserve until their fellow units fall, flee, or leave the battle. On the British side, British Regulars can field 2 units, Loyalist Militia can field 3, German Hessians can field 2, and Native Americans can field 2 as well. In this example, we have 2 Patriot Militia. Now a battle line has room for 3, but we only brought 2 to this fight, so that's all we have to work with. On the British side, there's 1 Loyalist Militia, there is room for 3, but we only have 1, and 1 British Regular, they have room for 2. In battles, the defender always has the initiative, so they get to go first. The British side rolls its dice, and the Loyalist Militia rolls a flee. The British Regular rolls his dice, and he rolls a command decision. Okay, so let's resolve these dice rolls. The Loyalist Militia rolled a flee, so this means they got scared and ran from the battle. So we're going to remove them from this battle. And we're going to move their unit to the fled unit section on the board. All fled units return to the game in the faction's next turn during the reinforcement phase, so we'll see him again later. Now with a command decision, you have a choice. You can either leave your unit where it is and continue the battle, or you can redeploy to a neighboring friendly territory. Now, even without the Loyalist Militia, the British Regular is extremely tough, so he figures he can probably take the Patriot Militia by himself, so he's just going to stay put and continue the battle. So that ends the British player's turn, and now we're going to play the Americans. The Patriot Militia rolls its 2 white dice, and it gets 2 command decisions. Now the Patriot Militia has a choice. They can either stick with the battle or they can deploy out and end the battle. Or, the choice that I will make is that I'm going to send 1 unit out of the battle. I'm going to redeploy 1 unit into that empty territory to help secure the Pennsylvania colony. Of course, that means now I need to beat the British Regular to finish securing the colony, and I only have 1 Patriot Militia to do this. This is probably not the most sound military strategy, but I want to illustrate a point. Since you have a limited number of movement cards, redeploying your armies during a battle is a good way to get units around the board. Sometimes you might want to take extra units into battle with the knowledge that there's going to be command decisions being rolled and you can redeploy those units. Just an idea. Now it's the British defender's turn. The British Regular rolls again and gets another command decision. The British player decides he's going to stick with the battle. Now it's the Americans' turn again. The Patriot Militia rolls his dice and gets a hit and eliminates the British Regular. Oh! Sorry, couldn't resist. Now, this is a very small battle, but when your side suffers a casualty, it is up to you to decide which casualty you're going to take. So a strategy in the game is to decide who's going to take the fall. If you have a lot of units in the battle, you need to make tough decisions, whether you're going to take out a cowardly loyalist militia and lose 3 attack dice, or if you're overstocked in British regular, you might take a hit on the stronger unit. So that's what makes the game pretty interesting. The battle is over and the Patriot militia are victorious. And they've secured Pennsylvania Colony, so this means they will be able to muster troops in the city of Philadelphia. This is one of the most interesting mechanics in the game. Not only does it influence how you configure your armies, but also how you take losses and who you keep and who you let go. So that completes the Patriot militia turn. Next, it's the Continental Army's turn. From here, you're going to repeat the same phases that we did with the Patriot militia, and so on. And that is basically the rules of 1775 Rebellion. Now, once you've got a few games under your belt and you're ready for a challenge, you can try the Siege of Quebec. The Siege of Quebec is a mini campaign that shows the Americans invading Quebec to capture important British supply ports in Montreal and Quebec. This game is recommended for experienced players only. There's a lot of campaign differences. It's reduced map, reduced decks, reduced units. You have to capture cities, and you can muster out of cities versus colonies, and you can only reinforce with 3 versus 4 units. For the Siege of Quebec campaign, you're only going to use the cards that have the fleur symbol in the corner. This means that each faction deck is only 9 cards, and once all players have worked through those cards and played all their truce cards, the game is over. So it's much faster than the regular game. When setting up a Siege of Quebec campaign, you're only going to use half of the game board. For setting up the game board, you can use the symbols on the map, except in 3 areas where I've marked it with X's. In these areas, you will place American units instead of British units, like I've listed here. Besides these units on the board, you will also place additional starting units. The Continental Army and the Patriot Militia will place 3 each in territories they own. The British Regulars and the Loyalist Militia will place 6 each in the territories they own. The key difference in the Siege of Quebec campaign is that instead of taking over entire colonies, you're focused on taking control of cities. When you take over a city, you place a control marker next to that city to gain a victory point. In this example, I've used colored rings instead of markers because the game board is too cluttered. And, much like in the main game, once all the truce cards have been played, the victory points are tallied up and you'll know who the winner is. Unlike most of my videos, this game is actually in print. If you order 1775 Rebellion from the Academy Games website, you'll also get this cool Treaty of Paris board and these card holders. You will not get these if you buy it anyplace else. There is also a decent digital version of 1775 that just came out. It's available for PC, iOS, and Android. I own the PC and the iOS versions, and like I said, it's a decent implementation of the game. One of the cool features is that instead of cubes, you can also elect to have these little figures on the board. They're fully 3D models that fight out the battles on the board, and they make really satisfying sounds when they die. Well, at least that's what I think. Anyway, that wraps up this edition of Harsh Rules. I thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.